I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. On April 22nd this year, gunmen in the town of Pahalgam, located in the disputed region of Kashmir, killed 26 people, mostly Indian tourists. A four-day military clash between India and Pakistan ensued, bringing both countries to the brink of a full-blown war before a ceasefire was reached on May 10th. During the India-Pakistan clashes, Beijing urged both sides to de escalate and called for a, quote, political settlement through peaceful means. But China did not play a neutral role in the conflict. Consistent with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's reported statement to his Pakistani counterpart that China fully understands Pakistan's legitimate security concerns and supports Pakistan in safeguarding its sovereignty and security interests, China reportedly provided intelligence, satellite equipment, and other forms of support to Pakistan before and during the clashes. To analyze China's role in the conflict, I have as my guest today Andrew Small. Andrew's a senior transatlantic fellow with GMF's Indo-Pacific program and author of two books on China, including The China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics, which is now 10 years old but remains an insightful and relevant study. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Andrew.
Thanks for the chance to join, Bunny.
So I want to dig into some of the diplomatic aspects of this, of Beijing's response to the clashes first. So we know that China issued several statements during the clashes, and it expressed the importance of peace and stability, its opposition to terrorism, and support for Pakistan's safeguarding of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, as you examine Beijing's wordings in these statements during and after the clashes, how do you assess Chinese interests and its approach to balancing its relations with India and Pakistan?
So there's kind of three elements to it. There's what they actually said, there's what they didn't say, and there's the context in which they said what they said. So there is, of course, as you've just explained, this kind of careful wording in which they want to show some support to Pakistan, they want to express appropriate concern about terrorism, they want to urge restraint, all of these sorts of things. And you can kind of go through and do comparisons with previous crises in 2019 or 2016 or things like that. But that's kind of the point with it. This is the sort of thing that you could have heard from China at all sorts of other points in the past. And given the scale of the Indian strikes, which went into some quite core Pakistani territory this time, given what had been assumed to be a kind of more robust China-Pakistan relationship, and just this wider dynamic that you've seen of sort of China leaning harder towards its friends, if you kind of trace this in some other relationships, I think you might have expected a bit more from Beijing than just saying that Indian actions were regrettable. It was really, I think, I mean, this is particularly what one got from the Indian side at the time. There was, if anything, a degree of surprise that there was so little criticism, and that all of this played out during this incredibly emotionally charged time. I mean, these were not a series of strikes that were taking place just in Kashmir. These were kind of playing out in sort of core territory between the two sides. You're seeing this in cities and things. And this is the Chinese language that you're hearing as if from another point in time. And then what you kind of got right towards the end of this, you have this call that Wang Yi has with the Pakistani foreign minister about Pakistan reaching a decision in line with its fundamental and long-term interests, which is the sort of, again, even more direct call for restraint. And then even a bit of a dig that you got from him as well about ensuring the safety of Chinese personnel and institutions. And again, if you didn't know the context for this, the context, of course, being that Chinese personnel have had a particularly bad time in Pakistan in recent years with a spate of terrorist attacks and things. That's been a real point of tension between the two sides. So what you kind of unusually got in this language was a kind of balance type approach from the Chinese side of the sort that you might have seen in the past. I think what's indicative, what it indicates basically is, first, clearly, this is a period in which China is also trying to stabilize relations with India, for reasons that particularly have to do with the strategic picture with the United States at the moment. And simultaneously, this is not a point in which relations with Pakistan are at their best. So I would say that this was not a juncture where China was necessarily going to come out politically swinging on Pakistan's behalf. They did run some diplomatic interference at the UN Security Council and things. But otherwise, what we will be, I think, doing that a lot of the rest of the time. I'm sure we'll spend some more time on the diplomacy, but this was quite back to the old focus of the Pakistan-China relationship, providing them with military capabilities, but taking a diplomatic role that, despite the different stakes and despite the different charge that this has, looked something like a role that China might have played further in the past.
So before we get into China's role on the military side and providing some support to Pakistan, one more question on the diplomatic front, and that is how Beijing viewed its own role. The Chinese repeated several times that they were prepared to play a constructive role, their language, in maintaining peace and stability between India and Pakistan. So do you see this as an offer to play the role of mediator? Is this similar to maybe China's role that it played with Iran and Saudi Arabia, trying to put its toe in the water as mediator? They have sort of offered to be a mediator in Ukraine, although nobody thinks that they could be a neutral mediator. But in this case, I wonder if you think China had any greater ambition to mediate this conflict, and how does China's history of border disputes with India and their investment in Pakistan through the CPEC corridor maybe hinder their ability or even their willingness to play the role of mediator between India and Pakistan?
So, I mean, from the Indian perspective, it's impossible for China to play a mediating role. There was zero trust in these previous contexts. There's zero trust now. It's understood that China is essentially on Pakistan's side in all sorts of fundamental ways. That didn't necessarily mean in the past that China didn't play a certain kind of political role when it came to communicating with both sides, even kind of paying visits when the crises were escalating at points in the past. If anything, I'd say China played a step back diplomatic role from what we'd seen in the past. And again, kind of counterintuitive when you're looking at some of these wider trends. But I think there was an extent to which China kept its head down until very, very late on in the proceedings, when you had some of these phone calls from Wang Yi that did take place. But I mean, you've had the role that China has at points usefully played has been to some extent restraining Pakistan, and there used to be, if you go back further in time to the 2000s, and even kind of basically from 1999. I mean, you have to look at all of this in the context of the period under the nuclear umbrella. So you have Kargil in 99, you have the Twin Peaks crisis, 2001, 2002, you have Mumbai. This is a period in which you have slightly complementary US and Chinese roles. China, in some of these cases, even coordinating with the United States, and the important role that it played in these contexts was to some extent restraining Pakistan, sometimes quite pushing back quite hard in 1999. I think you get into a very different period after 2016, because there's an understanding on the US side that it can't play this kind of neutral role that it used to between India and Pakistan. It's not consistent with the US-India relationship that's developing. So you get a kind of tilt on the US side, more in favor of India, certain forms of political support, certain forms of intelligence support, something that looks different from what you saw before. And that's 2016, the Uri attacks, and then what you have in 2019 as well. And then this is a period in which China, I think, sees more of a need, even diplomatically, to lean a bit more in Pakistan's direction in both of these crises, and to provide certain forms of support that it hadn't been doing before. And then I think this is why you were seeing, and I think we'll probably get onto this, you were getting more of a trajectory of a US-India nexus, a China-Pakistan nexus, and kind of how does this evolve diplomatically in some of these scenarios. And then this looked quite different again. It didn't look like China playing a particularly active political role in the proceedings. Again, the role that was important was essentially the military one. And what you did have after 2015 was this sense on the Chinese side that it was very, because of CPEC and some of these investments, it was very important that Pakistan restrained the role that it was playing. This was kind of a precondition for some of the investments. CPEC has not been going well. And so you haven't had this dimension as much. Again, Wang Yi putting some stress on protecting Chinese essentially assets and personnel, but not the kind of stress that you were getting when CPEC was really taking off. So again, coming back to the beginning of this, it felt like China playing more of a step back role on this than something that looked either like mediation or really putting a lot of background pressure on Pakistan in the way that you sometimes saw in the past.
Let's get into the meat of China's military role. So clearly, this conflict provided a testing ground for previously untested Chinese weaponry against some Western systems. And I think there was a lot of media attention to the long range PL-15 air to air missile. How do you assess the overall performance of China's weapons in the clashes? How do you think the Chinese assess them? Which, of course, is a really important question. Were observers surprised by Pakistan's success in downing several Indian aircraft?
Um, so what actually happened is still being kind of picked over. I think some of the stuff that's clear in general is India did launch a set of sort of a series of successful strikes on Pakistani territory. It's kind of clear from the satellite imagery and things. And Chinese air defenses were in play for this, and they didn't seem to perform so well. And they were, I think, you saw some language from the Chinese side that was a bit defensive about this. Pakistani strikes on India were also less successful. I think most of them seem to have been neutralized, drone attacks, missile strikes, things like this. The big crux, as you say, was the question of the shooting down of fighter jets. We don't know exactly how many. We don't know at what range. We don't know for sure with what systems. But again, best estimates from what we've heard a bit from US sources and a little from French sources does seem to be that it was the J-10s, it was the PL-15 missiles. There was at least one Rafale that was shot down. We don't know whether in total there was one, two, three, four higher numbers, but that's we certainly, it seems pretty clear that this is what played out, and this is now what's being touted by some on the Chinese side in terms of the systems that are being referenced. And what has to be borne in mind with this as well is it's not just these kind of the specific jet and the specific missile. It's also the radar systems, it's the airborne warning control systems. It's a kind of integrated set of systems. And the contextually interesting thing, of course, for this is the first conflict that you've seen that has engaged a number of these Chinese weapons. So they're not newest or the highest end Chinese kit, but it's the first time that they've been tested out in combat. And I think there was some degree of a surprise at the success of the performance. I think this is one of the reasons, of course, that the Indian side has been so careful about putting the material out on exactly what played out on this. This was the one kind of blow from their perspective, because in other ways, in lots of other ways, it was a successful operation. But I think this is the thing that with starting to get Chinese bloggers and Chinese journals and things starting to talk about a little bit more openly. So I think that seems to be roughly what checks out in terms of how the systems performed.
The Chinese media reports on the performance of Chinese weaponry that Pakistan used in this conflict have been really interesting, and they've been very careful. So there's been, for example, confirmation that the J-10 jets were deployed in what they called actual combat, but they have said nothing about specific time, place, or their performance. So, for example, we found a CCTV two-part documentary. It was called "The Legend of the J-10," which stated that those jets achieved impressive results in combat, but didn't provide any details. So, why do you think the Chinese government party state has decided to take such an approach, and what does this tell us about China's relationship with India?
Yeah, I mean, they're being very careful on the Sino-Indian relationship. This has been characteristic of everything that played out through the conflict, the aftermath, the lead up. So I think a lot of it can be attributed to that. Um, they have not seemed to squash the Pakistanis being pretty open about laying a lot of these things out. You know, this incredible video that was released just ahead of the conflict, basically showcasing all of these different Chinese weapon systems that were going to be in play, because I think it was clear early on that the two sides were going to engage in some kind of military engagement, and this was really the first point in which you had such a massively Sino-centric set of platforms in play on the Pakistani side. Even in 2019, you had F-16s, for instance, were involved. This was pretty much some Turkish drones this time, but largely this was a Sino-centric set of systems, all laid out very clearly on the Pakistani side. Lots of kind of aftermath material put out as well, and you have started to have some. I mean, you saw probably the piece by Joel Bow and others starting to come out and talk about this a little bit more. The most extreme claim being, or kind of like macro claim being, that this is another deep seek moment for China. That the performance of the J-10s and the PL-15 missiles was kind of the equivalent of the deep seek breakthrough, which is obviously kind of not in any sense a like for like, given that these are not the cutting edge Chinese technologies. This isn't some massive technological breakthrough, but as a sort of psychological moment to be able to say this is one of the first points in which Chinese weapon systems have come up against pretty advanced Western systems. I mean, the Rafales that were kind of relatively new to the Indian Air Force in the grand scheme of things. India is supposed to be the one that benefits from this incredible array of Russian, French, US, Israeli, all of these different platforms, and Pakistan's kind of just stuck with the Chinese stuff. And the Chinese side wants to be able to say, but look, if this is the two sides that are going up against each other conventionally, the Chinese systems are still able to perform well, at least in this kind of discrete area on the Air Force side. But again, not just on the Air Force side. The argument that you've had from some on the Chinese side that started to see is that it wasn't that the Chinese individual equipment was superior as such. It was the integration of all of these systems on the Chinese side that was kind of the critical thing that mattered. And even some Indian Air Force analysts have been saying a similar thing. India has much more of a kind of patchwork of systems. And this is going to be the interesting thing. I'm sure we'll kind of get into what this means for Chinese exports and things. The argument is likely to be it's not the individual equipment that matters. It's not just the J-10s. It's Pakistan being all in on China that was the big advantage that they gained on this.
China, of course, doesn't have a treaty with Pakistan. The only country it really has a defense treaty with is North Korea. But yet, in addition to selling military equipment, we know that from some sources, and I'd be curious if you can tell me what you've read, but Indian officials have claimed that China helped Pakistan with its radar, with its, as you mentioned earlier, air defense system, as well as satellite coverage to better detect Indian weapons. So, what does that tell you about China's relationship with Pakistan, since you've covered this relationship for so long? Are you surprised by the extent to which they went to help Pakistan militarily? You said earlier that you think the China Pakistan relationship is not at its best moment today. There are times in the past where it's been closer, but is that something you would have expected? And how does this revelation really affect China's ambition to act as a security guarantor in South Asia? What should we conclude from it?
So, I mean, I think the thing is, on the China-Pakistan military relationship and this capabilities provision on the Chinese side has been the sort of untouchable in the relationship. This has been the thing that you've had basically since the 60s. Whatever the other ups and downs in the relationship, the idea that fundamentally China will provide Pakistan with the capabilities that it needs, that's been the thing that doesn't change in the relationship. This is why Pakistan calls China its all-weather friend, because this has been the all-weatherness of the thing. And it used to be basically this mix of less sophisticated systems, tanks, small arms, things like this, artillery, some kind of technology transfer elements. They help build up Pakistan's own military industrial complex. They develop a number of these systems together over time. And then this support to the missile systems and the nuclear program. So, quite sensitive areas, including even the transfer of highly enriched uranium and a lot of elements of this. But what Pakistan was not able to get from China was some of these kind of advanced weapon systems, the fighter jets. They were things like this. They were seen to be lagging well behind the Western systems for a long time. What you've ended up getting in more recent years, kind of really over the last decade and a half, is this transition away on the Pakistani side, partly out of necessity, and I would say largely out of necessity, given the US-Pakistan relationship. That means that they're not going to continue to be able to get the best US systems anymore. They can kind of continue to use the F-16s in more limited ways and things like that. That was refreshed during the Biden administration. But basically, they're going to have this transition into a kind of all Chinese set of platforms. And that has included radar systems, but also satellite systems as basically the electronic spine of the Pakistani armed forces, to a degree that you basically see with virtually no other set of armed forces in the world. And this was the first conflict that played out with that all kind of fully integrated. And almost of necessity, this means that China plays a role in some of these scenarios where if it's going to continue to be reliable, it is going to help with the equipment, it's going to help with satellites, it's going to help with a number of these things that will bring it into play in these things, even though technically the two sides aren't allies, even though technically China wants to play a slightly more balanced role. And India knows this. So this is not a surprise, I think, to the Indian side. I don't think it's, I think this is just what one has to factor in now in any of these scenarios, that China's kind of unavoidably embroiled in any of these conflicts and will provide a certain form of technical support to Pakistan that will then, after after everything has played out, be laid out quite openly on the Indian side, and will be understood by the Indian public that this is the role that China plays in any of these scenarios, which of course puts an upper limit on what you're ever going to get on kind of Sino-Indian normalization, aside from the Sino-Indian dynamics on the border. And this just kind of reminds everyone of all of this all over again. But I think this, as time goes on and as PLA platforms become even more the quality improves, this becomes even more important to some of the Indo-Pak dynamics and the future performance of the Pakistanis in these conflicts. And again, I think what the Chinese want to say with this and argue is that this helps give Pakistan the conventional deterrence that it needs to reduce also the need for the two sides to escalate to the nuclear level. They continue to insist that what they are doing is a kind of balancing role in the region to ensure that India isn't able to overwhelm Pakistani capabilities, and the argument that this is in some sense or other a stabilizing role, given the nuclear dynamics that there are in the region. So that's the kind of additional propaganda piece that plays out around all of this.
You mentioned earlier the implications for Chinese arms exports. So China's currently the fourth largest exporter of conventional arms, behind the United States and France and Russia. Um, I would assume Beijing will seek to leverage this conflict to strengthen, the image, the reputation of Chinese-made weapons. How much do you think they will actually be able to benefit from it? Should we be looking at a real surge of Chinese conventional arms going forward?
So, I mean, there's two interesting pieces. One is the really specific platforms where they're already making the pitch and saying, for countries that do not have access to the best Western systems, if you haven't thought about buying some of these platforms, now is the time. Kind of, I mean, you're already seeing these kind of pitches being made for the individual platforms, and countries named that might be particular kind of might want to take a closer look. And again, the argument being, if you have these, they are able to go toe to toe with at least the systems that you're likely to come up against on the Western side or others. Because I mean, of course, what China was also going up against in this case was Russian equipment. Another thing. I mean, this was not for all the claims. This is not a U.S. versus the West purely, or U.S. Or sorry, China versus the West, or China versus, certainly not China versus the United States. This was a kind of complex mix of systems on the Indian side. But really, there is this other pitch that I would stress, that they are going to argue: don't buy a single piece of equipment. Don't just buy the fighter jets. That's not going to get you where you need. What you need is a closer defense relationship with China of the sort that the Pakistanis have, because the way that you're going to be able to achieve the performance level that you need with this is an integration of systems, close training with us, basically make more of this kind of deep bet on China and a deeper military and security partnership, rather than just thinking that the kind of patchwork version and buying individual systems is going to be the thing that delivers the results that you need. And that, to me, is going to be the more interesting element of the pitch. How does this also translate politically, and in a period of time in which this has been the argument more broadly that China has been making to a number of countries, that is, it's time to go into a relationship that is not just the political and economic, that is a security one. And now the additional layer on top of that is, and if you do, this will deliver some level of at least equivalence with the sort of systems that you may be able to get from the West.
Great, really interesting. So, in the aftermath of the crisis, if you look at India's analysis of China's involvement, Pakistan's analysis of China's involvement, what are you seeing in their assessments? How do they each view China's role, both during and after the crisis?
So, I mean, on the Pakistani side, this is again back to the fundamentals this has been a difficult time, I would say, in the last few years on the China-Pakistan relationship. I think China's been quite frustrated by the Pakistanis in different ways. Some of the lack of success of CPEC, the security conditions for their personnel in the country. I think they've held the Pakistani army responsible for the very kind of difficult economic and political situation that Pakistan's been in, and the failure of some of their flagship projects, what's gone on in Afghanistan. But despite all of this, when it comes to the fundamentals of Pakistani security interests, the bet has, in some sense, paid off. They're not just stuck in a completely invidious position by being as sort of China dependent as they are on the military side. They may not get the displays of public support and political support that they might want, but in these kind of crisis conditions, they're still going to get the essentials that they need from the Chinese side when it comes to military support, and some elements of the diplomatic support that they need. So I think from their perspective, it will probably be that after a pretty testing time in the relationship, when it comes down to it, the things that China delivers are still the important things. And maybe there are failures politically and economically in other areas, but that the reasons to continue this bet that I think they feel partly also stuck with at the moment is still one that can deliver some of the things that they need. I think on the Indian side, yes, they will note that China was relatively restrained. It has not been excessively provocative in the way that they handled any of this politically, quite sort of measured by the sort of standards that you might have expected, not so much overt political backing to Pakistan. So I don't think you necessarily get an obvious setback politically to some of the modest stabilizing dynamics that we've seen between China and India in the last period of time. But I think the fundamentals of this are still, we're now moving clearly into a phase in which India has to deal with a situation in which Pakistan's systems are massively Sino-centric, that China is going to be even more embroiled in these kind of conflicts than it was before. And I think there's going to be this question over time of what this means as some of the more sophisticated systems even come into play as well. I think there's going to be the question as well of There's been a long-standing debate about whether China should export the J-35 and things like this. This is going to be something that India has to take into account in a different way on the conventional side as things go forward. But again, none of this that's surprising. I think this is what India has understood is the nature of the relationship between the two sides. How that's handled politically is a separate question. How delicately it's played, and I think they did play it slightly more delicately, but the fundamentals are in that, on all the other areas unchanged, aside from some questions around the performance of the Chinese equipment.
Finally, how does the intensifying US-China rivalry influence the dynamics of the China-India-Pakistan relationship? Some people would say triangular relationship. What are the risks of a local conflict like the one we just witnessed really being shaped and escalated by great power competition?
So, I mean, this actually also goes back to the very first question about kind of what was new, what was on trend on all of this. And the interesting thing is when you look at what played out on the ground and you compare it to different Indo-Pakistani kind of near misses, conflicts, and things, this was really quite different in all sorts of respects. You had the use of cruise missiles, you had ballistic missiles, you had all of this drone warfare, you had strikes in Punjab and Rawalpindi, you had all these questions about Chinese weapon systems. This was very different in terms of how the dynamics actually played out between the two sides. But diplomatically, this was like a kind of throwback to another era, even before 2016, in some respects. Basically, you had the US doing something that, in the end, even if no one wants to say it was mediation, had resembled mediation in certain respects, and it was easy to claim that it was mediation both on the Pakistani side and Trump himself. China trying to balance elements of its relationship between Pakistan and India in a way that hadn't really been doing during the last couple of iterations of these crises. I think was this one. I had one question coming quite early on about whether this was now, kind of proxy war between the US and China and the West and China and things. And I mean, as I say, this wasn't even true of the weapon systems. It was the S-400s were the particularly consequential part of the missile defense systems on the Indian side in this case. And, it was Rafales on among the systems. So not a US-China kind of political or military dynamic on some of this. Aside, I mean, yes, you have a US tilt to India, China tilt to Pakistan, some of these sorts of things. But if anything, the US-China relationship in influencing this was part of the major influence on why China is looking to stabilize its relationship with India right now. Because I think, of course, it's trying to do this with several of the major actors. It's trying to unwind, evidently, a number of the things that it did in 2020 and 2021 to put itself on a different footing with the United States, or to put itself in a different footing to deal with the United States. And then, of course, what you saw on the Indian side was a lot of frustration about the Trump administration's public handling of all of this. I think from their side, the expectation was they would have the backing and the space, and all the pressure would really be on Pakistan over the terrorism issue. And you'd have none of this kind of both sides, and certainly no talk about mediating on Kashmir, and all of this internationalizing Kashmir, hyphenating the two sides, mediation. These have, I think, basically all been red lines for India. So you've had in the political aftermath quite a bit of frustration with Trump and the administration on how some of this has played out. So I think when you step back from all of this, you have all of these broader, interesting trends on US-China, on Chinese foreign policy, and then this, in some cases, is not confirmatory. It's not reinforcing. It's slightly different. It's got very specific qualities to it in terms of how it's related to all of those. And it's therefore been a particularly interesting one to dig into the details and specifics to try and make sense of all of this, rather than assuming that it's going to conform with some of these prior and wider patterns.
We've been talking with Andrew Small, who is Senior Transatlantic Fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific Program. I think the leading expert on China-Pakistan relations. We're really lucky to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew.
Thanks, Bonnie.